Okay. So now Moses had a sort of an intellectually centered house where guests often came over. He had also hosted dinner party discussions. But in Moses', her father's house, women didn't participate. They merely served. Moses had made sure that Dorothea and her mother knew enough English, French, and music to be gracious hostesses. Dorothea had had no say in her engagement to Simon Veit. It was made when she was 14. Simon was 10 years older than her. They married after a 5-year engagement. And Moses, by all accounts, was a good guy, and he thought he had done well by Dorothea. He had picked one of his favorite of the young Jewish men of Berlin, someone who was a well-off banker and could provide her a secure and comfortable life. But Simon Veit had little interest in art, music, and literature, the very things that Dorothea passionately loved. Dorothea writes in her diary, "In a good marriage, it is necessary that the wife has just enough intelligence to understand her husband. Any more than that is a curse." Dorothea maintained the appearance of a happy marriage, perhaps even to Simon, as long as her father Moses was alive. Just after he died, she was about to leave Simon, but then she got pregnant. To her closest friends, Schleiermacher, Rahel, Henrietta, she compared her life to slavery. Apologizing to a friend for not writing earlier, Dorothea writes, "Just remember how closely crushed I am in my domestic circle in winter, and how my existence therefore becomes so unpleasant. In fact, I find only seldom a moment in which I am cheerful and collected enough to write my friends." She writes that her death was a given if she had continued to live unworthily. There's a second big roadblock. Dorothea is Jewish. And that's a big deal in 19th century Berlin. In a city of 112,000 inhabitants, only about 3,000 are Jews. They had been expelled in the 15th century and only recently let back into the city. They're not citizens of the city. They're only allowed to live there by special invitation of the king. And the only reason the king invites certain Jews to live in the city is because he wants to tax them. So he only lets in businessmen and doctors and their households. There are a lot of special restrictions for the Jews, right? The Jews need permission to travel. The Jews need permission to buy a house. The Jews need permission to marry because the king didn't want too many. Here's one of the quirkier, you can do the next slide, Michael. One of the quirkier restrictions on the Jews, King Frederick II had started up a porcelain factory for the city and state of Berlin, and it wasn't very good. And so one of the requirements on the Jews was that when they got married, they were obligated to buy a certain amount of porcelain from this factory, right? Which is why Moses Mendelssohn, the famous philosopher, had 6 hideous porcelain monkeys in his house. Okay? Berlin, like many old European cities, was a walled city. It had 15 gates you had to pass through to get in or out. Jews were only allowed to use one of them, the same one that livestock went through. Another one. This is where the gate was. This is modern-day Berlin. That Tower of Eastern Germany was there. But you can see. Is this going to work? No. You can see. Well, this is. Linienstrasse is the street that was the circle where the wall was, right? And then this is Rosenthaler Strasse, which is goes to the Rosenthaler gate where the Jews could enter and exit the city. Moses Mendelssohn, in a letter, describes trying to explain to his children why, when they were out on a weekend walk, some people were throwing stones at them. Another slide, Michael. All right, here's kind of an aesthetic. I don't know what to call this. It's too early to call it anti-Semitism, but here's the 3 women I'm talking about today, Dorothea, Rahel, and Henrietta. In the letters, their contemporaries always offer descriptions. These are what they look like. They always say of Dorothea and Rahel, they're kind of plain, they're beautiful on the inside, not so much on the outside. And then they often add, they look very Jewish. And then when they describe Henrietta, who's also Jewish, they say she's beautiful, and she looks Greek, which is just puzzling and insidious. Ironically, this precarious position as outsiders, as Jews, is one of the factors that made the salons hosted by the Jewish women so vibrant. There was no other place in Berlin where nobility could or would hang out with artists and actors, where men and women could talk freely, where Jews and Christians could socialize. The homes of Dorothea and Rahel and Henrietta created a space where all kinds of people could gather in a way that had not been possible in Europe up to this point. At the same time, the Jewish women who hosted so many gatherings were never invited over to the homes of their Christian friends. Okay, so on January 11th, 1799, Dorothea makes the extremely bold and risky move for her time of separating from her husband. She becomes a social pariah even beyond her struggles as a Jew. But in a letter, after describing the very few possessions she was allowed to take with her, she had like 3 things with her when she left her husband's house. She moved out and rented a room in the cheapest neighborhood in Berlin. She writes in this letter, she is happy for the first time. Like someone set free, who now for the first time can call something her own, after she belongs to herself, and who with eager care guards it. When she's separated from her husband, Dorothea's and Friedrich's friends start to ask him if they're going to get married. Their current arrangement is scandalous. But one problem is that to marry Friedrich, Dorothea would have to convert to Christianity, and this would inflict further pain on her mother, and would prevent her from having any role in raising her children. In addition, Dorothea and Friedrich both believed that because of their passionate love, they already were married, in the only sense that is important. Next slide. Friedrich writes to Novalis, "I wrote you 14 months ago about my friend. She has since then step by step become my wife, and will remain so eternally. In civil view, she's still the wife of another man, although she has been separated conjugally from him for years. I will never separate myself from her. I wish no more than to live with her in total unity, no matter in what form." To his sister-in-law, Friedrich writes, "To bind ourselves civilly has never been our intention." He calls marriage the hated ceremony, and contrasts the goal of marriage as a cold, calculating attempt, quote, "to even out present and future," with the passionate true marriage he already shares with Dorothea. To cave into social pressure, he writes, would, quote, "destroy my dearest convictions." So true marriage for Dorothea and Friedrich is not a legal contract, but a passionate love that merges or unifies 2 people into a single whole. Okay, lest I get too sappy here, I need to add that everybody who writes about Friedrich Schlegel eventually notes that he could be a kind of a dog. In the very same letter to his sister-in-law, he goes on to note the difference in age between him and Dorothea. She's 7 years older. He writes, "Now while we're both young, of course, it doesn't matter. But taking the longer view, he foresees a day, quote, when I will be young, but she will not. If they remain together, he'll be living, quote, without a wife. He'll be settling, quote, for a journeyman. In other words, her sexual passion will die out before his, and they will no longer be truly married." He rather coldly adds, "She will probably not be my last love, as hers to me is not her first." In 1804, when her sons are a bit older, Friedrich and Dorothea do in fact get married, and they remain married until Friedrich's death in 1829 did them part. And then Dorothea lives until 1839. All right, Friedrich was brilliant, but he had trouble holding a job. He started a lot more projects than he finished, and the couple was always broke. In a desperate attempt to improve their financial situation, Friedrich wrote a novel which he thought would be a bestseller. It's an autobiographical story of his love affair with Dorothea. The novel's called Lucinda. Lucinda's very thinly veiled Dorothea. He intends the book not just as a moneymaker, but as the Bible of a new religion. He literally calls it in letters to his friends, this is the Bible of a new religion, the religion of love. So I am a professor of religious studies, so I thought I should, tell you why I'm talking about this. It's a new religion, the religion of love, in which people could see, through the example of him and Dorothea, that the divine is not separate from passionate love, nor is love a stepping stone on the way to the divine, but passionate love is itself divine. Okay, that's kind of the key idea, right? It's not, love isn't something that gets you somewhere else. You love someone and they teach you about God. Love is itself divine. And love is divine in these senses. One, it gives meaning to life. And secondly, it puts you in direct contact with the creative powers of nature. The book was a flop because everybody thought it was pornographic. Friedrich did include a scene in a section entitled "On the Loveliest Situation in the World," in which the fictional Friedrich and the fictional Dorothea changed traditional sex roles during a session of lovemaking. The book did, if possible, make the couple even more outcast, most people, including Friedrich's brother and sister-in-law, declining to visit them or have them in their homes. Eventually, Dorothea was able to earn some money for the family through translations of French books into German and a novel of her own, Florentine, which Michelle and Edward read from, which is also a love story. Her book sold far better than Friedrich's had. So let's summarize here what we learned about love from Friedrich and Dorothea's love story. Love is passionate, meaning it involves sexual desire. It's monogamous, at least serially. Passionate love for Dorothea means love between a woman and a man. The women play active, even leading roles, both intellectually and, if we read Friedrich's novel as very autobiographical, sexually. So that's important. The women play an active role here. Without love, life, Dorothea thinks, is pointless. Love is what makes a marriage legit. Love is what makes a marriage legit, with or without a license. Without love, a marriage is not a true marriage. Love is a complete merging, especially in sex, of two people. This is in turn a merging with the creative power of the universe. Love for Dorothea and Friedrich is sacramental. It becomes religious. It's like the Bible is for Luther, literally. It's where you find meaning, the point of life, where you come in contact with the divine. Dorothea risks everything for it. So, there's the love story of Dorothea and Friedrich. And if I had to guess, I have no idea what you guys are thinking right now. If I had to guess, I guess your reaction is something like, hey, that's beautiful. I've seen a bunch of movies like that, star-crossed lovers. It seems like kind of a normal love story to us. So what I want to do now is go back in time and tell a couple more stories, they're shorter stories, to show how thoroughly Dorothea and Rahel and Henrietta and their generation reshuffled the deck, how they changed love to how we think about it now. Okay, so if I only know one thing, I only know one way to think about it, which is to take a historical running start. So I'm going to go way back in time, from my next love story back to the 5th century BCE. And if you don't know why I say BCE instead of just BC, just ask somebody in a robe. All right, this love story is portrayed by Plato in his famous dialogue, The Symposium. Okay. It turns out that the Symposium is a fancy name for a drunken dinner party. And here you see people are in various states of being disrobed, and they've got chalices, and they're drinking a lot of wine. Right off the bat, we see we're dealing with something very different than the Berlin salons of Henrietta and Rahel and Dorothea. There's no women present, it's all men. Okay. The entertainment at this symposium would be that each guest in turn has to get up and give a speech in praise of love. All the speeches are pretty fascinating, but I'm going to talk about two of them. One by a young man named Alcibiades, and one by the older man, the famous Socrates. So there's Alcibiades. Alcibiades enters late, he misses dinner, he's drunk. When he sees Socrates, it's clear that Alcibiades is fixated on him. And so the guest suggests that as his speech, Alcibiades give a speech of praise about Socrates. Alcibiades compares Socrates to a satyr. A satyr is a kind of a goat man. But says that the moment he hears Socrates speak, I'm smitten with a kind of sacred rage. My heart jumps into my mouth. Alcibiades' speech largely consists of the history of his attempts to seduce Socrates. He says, I used to flatter myself that he was smitten with my youthful charms. Alcibiades tries to get Socrates alone, but when they are alone, Socrates fails to whisper, quote, those sweet things that lovers whisper to their darlings. So Alcibiades steps up his game. He invites Socrates to the gym to exercise and to wrestle. When that fails, he says, I realized there was nothing to be gained in that direction, but having put my hand to the plow, I wasn't going to look back until I was absolutely certain how I stood. So I decided to make a frontal attack. Alcibiades invites Socrates to dinner. The first time Socrates comes over, he just leaves as soon as dinner's over. So Alcibiades invites him again, and this time he plots to keep Socrates talking, not hard to do, until it's too late for Socrates to go home. Quote, when the lights were out and the servants had all gone, I made up my mind to stop beating about the bush and tell him what I thought point blank. So I nudged him and I said, are you asleep, Socrates? Socrates responds that if Alcibiades is trying to barter his beauty for the beauty he has found in Socrates, in other words, if Alcibiades is trying to get Socrates to sleep with him because Alcibiades is physically attractive, then he is, quote, driving a hard bargain. Alcibiades is trying to exchange the semblance of beauty for the thing itself. Socrates' beauty is of a different and of a higher order. And in fact, Socrates declines the bargain. Alcibiades complains, when I got up the next morning, I had no more slept with Socrates within the meaning of the act than if he'd been my father or an elder brother. Next slide. What is this beauty that Socrates possesses? In Socrates' own speech to the guests at the symposium, he claims he learned from Diotima, a wise woman, the true meaning of love. Passionate love, sexual love, the love Alcibiades has for Socrates is good, but it's only the first step on a heavenly ladder. What Alcibiades really loves, though he doesn't know it yet, is wisdom. If he hangs around Socrates enough, he may learn it. So, just a personal story, since we're sitting here and I'm a professor now. I remember my second grade librarian was Miss Springfield. She was very tall, she had a beehive hairdo, and I can still remember what her perfume smells like. Okay. Okay. So Socrates argues, Socrates argues that when we love a specific person, then we realize that we should love every lovely body, so monogamy is not a high value to the Greeks. And when we reach that rung of the educational ladder, we realize that what is really beautiful are not beautiful bodies, but beautiful souls. And then we see that what makes a soul beautiful is wisdom or knowledge. Okay, so at the top of the ladder that we climbed onto for reasons of sexual passion, we realize that what we love is philosophy. The end game is a life of rational discussion among friends, a lot like the symposium. There's Alcibiades and Socrates together at the symposium. Note that this relationship is most likely among men. All the speeches about love at the symposium are about the love between young men and older men, which is a normal arrangement in Athens. The speechifiers at the symposium don't rule out the possibility that a man could love a woman, but it's a lower form of love, because it leads inevitably to children and all the distractions of a home that keep a man from the true goal, which is the study of philosophy. If done properly, pursuit of the younger man by the older man is valid. It's maybe even the best form of sensual love. And what they mean by proper is this: the older man ought to be the pursuer because the active role is more masculine. Once the younger man is old enough to begin shaving, it's no longer appropriate for him to allow himself to be pursued. Then it's time, once you're old enough to shave, for you to become the pursuer. In other words, it's time for you to perform your masculinity and go find other younger men. The reason for the younger man to play along with the pursuit and to gratify the old man's sexual desires is to spend time with him learning wisdom. Okay, so for keeping score, in ancient Greece, or at least in the symposium, love begins with sexual desire, but leaves that behind for a desire for reason. Love is not monogamous. The highest form of love is between men. Masculinity is associated with activity. Femininity is associated with passivity. Sensual love is important, not in and of itself, but because it leads to the love of wisdom. And a life without wisdom is not worth living. Love has little or nothing to do with civil marriage and wedding ceremonies. It's a very different deck of cards than the one we're playing with. All right, one more story. Working our way forward again back towards Dorothea. We're going to pause in the 12th century and talk about the famous love story of Heloise and Abelard. Abelard was a philosopher. He was so talented that the University of Paris, which is the second oldest university in the world, was founded on his reputation. But early in his career, he was hired by a man named Fulbert as a tutor for Fulbert's enormously gifted niece Heloise. In a way that Socrates might have approved, but Iliff's Title IX officers for sure would not, they fell passionately in love. Right? She is his student. Heloise becomes pregnant. When Uncle Fulbert found out, he was of course outraged. Abelard agreed to marry Heloise, but on one condition, that the marriage be kept secret. He and Heloise were both concerned that a public wedding would announce their sins to the world. It is, after all, a shotgun wedding. Furthermore, in a world in which all intellectual careers are careers in the Catholic Church, to be married for Abelard would prevent him from ordination, which might close off some of the highest possible church careers. And here the story goes from bad to worse. Fulbert, Heloise's uncle, how many people know this story? Okay, all right. Heloise's uncle can't keep quiet about the marriage. He mistreats Heloise, who's still living in his house. Abelard removes her from her uncle's house and places her in a cloister, and for reasons unclear, he has her wear the garb of a novitiate. So next slide. So there's Abelard and Heloise in their religious garb. But their passionate relationship continues. Abelard meets Heloise in the cloister. They have sex in the back of the cafeteria, which is the only place they can find to be alone together. Abelard later writes that even though they're not now technically living in sin, their behavior in that hallowed place was nevertheless shameless. Fulbert, Heloise's uncle, meanwhile concludes that Abelard is going back on his deal to marry Heloise and is trying to turn her into a nun and pawn her off on the cloister. He hires a bunch of thugs to sneak into Abelard's bedroom at night and castrate him. As Abelard later describes it, he entitles his autobiography, "The History of Calamities." Right? Quote, "They cut off the parts of my body whereby I had committed the wrong of which they complained. The thugs flee, but two are caught. They are in turn castrated and then blinded for good measure. Heloise and Abelard take religious vows. She goes on to have a brilliant career as the head of a cloister. He has a brilliant career as a scholar. Later in life, they're both now living their religious lives. In an exchange of letters, we get a glimpse of what Heloise and Abelard think about love, marriage, and religious devotion. Heloise is working hard to establish and administer her cloister. She writes to Abelard to say how cruel it is that he has not written her. And we have to admit, Abelard too can be a bit of a dog. It's kind of a theme. She argues that she never wanted to get married in the first place. She only did it because he asked her to. The name of wife, this is a great quote, "The name of wife may seem more sacred or more binding, but sweeter for me will always be the word mistress, or if you will permit me, that of concubine or whore." She gives at least 3 reasons for this shocking position on marriage. First, she prefers love to wedlock, freedom to chains. Second, though their affair was not legal by civil law, she thinks it was a perfect tie of the spirit and therefore genuine. And finally, marriage is incompatible with scholarship. Who can concentrate on thoughts of scripture or philosophy and be able to endure babies crying, nurses soothing them with lullabies, and all the noisy coming and going of men and women about the house? Will he put up with the constant muddle and squalor which small children bring into the home? In response, Abelard writes that he wants her to devote herself to a higher love, a love of God. It's a very Socratic move. He argues that their fleshly love has put him now in a position where they can pursue a religious love. But Heloise replies that, quote, "I'm surprised when instead of bringing me the healing balm of comfort, you increased my desolation and made the tears flow which you should have dried." She does not want the new love, but the old one. In my case, the pleasures of lovers, which we shared, have been too sweet. They can never displease me and can scarcely be banished from my thoughts. Wherever I turn, they are always there before my eyes, bringing with them awakened longings and fantasies, which will not even let me sleep. Even during the celebration of the Mass, when our prayers should be purer, lewd visions of these pleasures take such a hold upon my unhappy soul. Heloise prefers earthly paradise, even if it costs her a heavenly one. All right, so how shall we score the love between Heloise and Abelard? Their love is heterosexual. Heloise does not think passion and marriage are compatible. Neither of them thinks that sexual love is compatible with the love of the divine. While Abelard hopes that sexual love is a path to a religious love, Heloise simply prefers the former to the latter. She prefers death to life alone, and she feels alone even though she's living in a community of women. Heloise reflects the idea we saw in Greece that to be feminine is to be passive. She disagrees with Abelard that they ought to get married. She disagrees with Abelard that they ought to take religious vows, but she does it anyway. Not exactly the same deck Socrates played with, definitely not the same deck that Dorothea deals from. All right, here's my conclusion. To the end, I circle back to what the Salon Jewesses have taught us about how to think about love. The love story of Dorothea and Friedrich seems normal to us. The stories of Alcibiades and Socrates and Heloise and Abelard seem more foreign. We're still playing with the deck dealt by Dorothea and Rahel and Henrietta. And I think this is the deck that we're playing with. right? Passionate love is what gives meaning to life. Without it, marriage is not a real marriage. With it, a marriage license may not be necessary. Love for Dorothea and Rahel and Henrietta was heterosexual, but they were not less feminine for playing the active role. Love is not a barrier to the divine or to religion. Love is not a stepping stone to a higher love of reason or of God. Love is itself divine. It's a case of finding the infinite in the finite, to use Schleiermacher's famous definition of religion. These are ideas that are worked out in conversations in the salons and discussed in letters. They're ideas that Dorothea and Rahel and Henrietta actualized in their own lives. Each of them bucked social expectations and intense pressure. Each suffered extended periods of crushing poverty and were treated as pariahs because of their choices. Two of them, Dorothea and Rahel, ended up married. One, Henrietta, went to great lengths after her husband died to not get married again. So, why spend time studying the writings and lives of dead people? There are two reasons. The first one is just selfish. This is more fun than many other jobs I can think of. But there's a more pressing reason. When we see that the things we think are normal are not given to us by nature or dropped from Mount Sinai, when we see that they have a history, when we see that sex and love and femininity and masculinity and marriage and reason and religion have been pulled apart and recombined in vastly different ways in the past, then we see that they can be pulled apart and recombined again. The time lapse between the TV show Will and Grace, seeming like an edgy TV show, and marriage equality declared the law of the land by the Supreme Court was, in historical terms, amazingly rapid. Okay, I'm all for marriage equality, to be clear, but part of what made that rapid change possible was the claim, and it's a very, very conservative claim, that nothing had changed about marriage. We just made it legal for same-sex couples. It's a new hand, but it's not a new deck. The idea, though, that marriage is the normal arrangement works for many. For everyone? I'm guessing that the part that seems unfamiliar to you about Dorothy and Friedrich is that they call love a religion. But if you think about it, right? Among my colleagues, my friends, and my family, I don't know very many that are concerned if a friend of theirs is in a long-term relationship with somebody of a different religion or no religion. They have a lot of concern if there's no long-term relationship. Can they be fulfilled? Is their life meaningful enough? Do we know somebody we can set them up with? These are not questions that bothered Alcibiades and Socrates or Heloise and Abelard. And what about those who don't fit our assumptions about masculinity and femininity? The rates of poverty and homelessness and violence against them are high. What we learned from Dorothy, this is the big conclusion. I'm bad at concluding, so I'm going to tell you that so you know when I'm done, okay? This is the conclusion. What we learned from Dorothea and Rahel and Henrietta is how we came to think about love the way we do. We also learned from their example that with courage, we can change what's normal so that it works for more people. That's it.
Sit there and count your fingers. What can you do? Oh girl, you're through. Sit there and count your little fingers. Unhappy little girl blue. Sit there and count the raindrops falling on you, for it's time you knew all you can ever really count on are the raindrops that fall on little girl blue. Won't you just sit there and count the little raindrops falling on you? 'Cause it's time you knew all you can ever really count on are the raindrops that fall on little girl blue. No use, oh girl, you might as well surrender, 'cause your hopes are getting slender and slender. Whoa, won't somebody send a tender blue boy to cheer up little girl?